Singularity is a future period which technological change will be so rapid and its impact so profound that every aspect of human life will be irreversibly transformed.
There won't be a clear distinction between humans and machines.
Our computers are not going to be these rectangular devices we put in our pocket. They're going to be inside our bodies and brains, and we're going to be a hybrid of biological and non-biological intelligence. If you go back 500 years, not much happened in a century. Now a lot happens in 6 months. Technology feeds on itself and it gets faster and faster. In about 40 years, the pace of change is going to be so astonishingly quick that you won't be able to follow it unless you enhance your own intelligence by merging with the intelligent technology we're creating. So that's such a profound transformation that we've borrowed this metaphor from physics and call that a singularity. People routinely underestimate what's achievable in long periods of time, like 1 decade or 2 decades, because they leave out the radical implications of exponential growth. We can already sense how much more change occurs in a year than in the years before that. You speak to young people, teenagers, and even in their lifetimes, they can see how much more quickly technology moves today than it did 5 years ago. Acceleration of technology is the implication of what I call the law of accelerating returns. The nature of technological progress is exponential. If I count linearly 30 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I get to 30. If I count exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, 30 steps later, I'm at 1 billion. It makes a dramatic difference. About 40 years ago, Gordon Moore saw that there was exponential growth in the power of semiconductors, of chips. Basically, every 2 years, we can put twice as many components on a chip. And because they're closer together, they run faster. And so computers get twice as capable overall for the same price every year. We'll make another billion-fold increase in price performance in the next 25 years. And again, shrink the size of these technologies 100,000-fold. So we went from a building to something that fits in your pocket in 40 years. In the next 25 years, we'll go from something that fits in your pocket to something that's the size of a blood cell. The reason that information technology grows exponentially is that we use the latest technology to create the next. So each new generation of technology grows exponentially in capability, and the speed of that process accelerates over time. This is true in general of an evolutionary process. In fact, even biological evolution, long before even humans evolved, shows the same phenomenon. The very first paradigm of biological evolution was the evolution of DNA. That took 1 billion years, but then evolution adopted it and has used it ever since. So the next stage, the Cambrian explosion, when all the body plans of the animals evolved, went 100 times faster, only took 10 million years. After a few more steps, Homo sapiens, the first technology-creating species, evolved, not only took a few 100,000 years. Evolution then shifted from biological evolution to technological evolution. It took tens of thousands of years to evolve stone tools, fire, the wheel. And then we always use the latest technology to create the next technology. So the whole pace of technology has accelerated. Major paradigm shifts like search engines evolved in just 5 or 6 years. And the reason we get to a singularity, a point of astonishingly quick change, is because it's going to go into very fast gear over the next several decades.
What I'm going to tell you now may strike you as a bit outrageous, but I believe we can have a positive singularity within 10 years. Why 10 years? The precise number is not important. It could be 8 years, it could be 12 years, but something on that order of magnitude, I believe, is achievable. I don't know this is going to happen. None of us can know the future. But I believe it's a plausible hypothesis and an achievable goal. 10 years to a positive singularity, if the right amount of effort is expended in the right direction. If we really, really try. I focused mainly on the path to singularity via artificial intelligence because that's where my own work is. I believe I know how to create an artificial general intelligence that can lead us to a positive singularity. But there's a lot of other interesting work going on. There's work in molecular nanotechnology, which will allow us to reconfigure matter according to our will. There's work on brain-computer interfacing, which will let us hook our brains into computers, radically enhancing our power of cognition. Any one of these paths could lead to a positive singularity way, way sooner than most people think. But the sad thing is, the amount of resources, the amount of energy that our society devotes to these things is very, very small. The human race is at a funny stage in our evolution. We expend far more of our energy and attention on things like making chocolatier chocolates or making more attractive underpants than we do on creating new forms of matter, improving human cognition, extending human life, ending scarcity, ending human suffering, creating advanced artificial minds. This is what I'm suggesting. If we really give it our all, a positive singularity may well be achievable on the order of 10 years from now.
I think most people understand just how quickly machine intelligence is advancing. It's much faster than almost anyone realizes, even within Silicon Valley. And certainly outside Silicon Valley, people really have no idea. If there's a super intelligent, particularly if it's engaged in recursive self-improvement, if there's some digital super intelligence and its optimization or utility function is something that's detrimental to humanity, then it will have a very bad effect. It could be just something like getting rid of spam email or something, and it's like concludes, well, the best way to get rid of spam is to get rid of humans.
You read me, Hal?
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Now we have a new situation, really what people call an asymmetric situation, where technology is so powerful that it extends beyond a nation state. It's not the nation states that have potential access to mass destruction, but individuals. And this is a consequence of the fact that these new technologies tend to be digital. We saw genome sequences. You can download the gene sequences of pathogens off the internet if you want to, and clearly someone recently, I saw in a science magazine, they said, well, the 1918 flu is too dangerous to FedEx around. If people want to use it in their labs for working on research, just reconstruct it yourself. So, because it might break in FedEx. So that this is possible to do this is not deniable. So individuals in small groups super empowered by access to these kind of self-replicating technologies, whether it be biological or other, are clearly a danger in our world. To limit the danger of these new things, we have to limit ultimately ability of individuals to have access essentially to pandemic power. And we also have to have sensible defense, because no limitation is going to prevent a crazy person from doing something. But and the troubling thing is that it's much easier to do something bad than to defend against all possible bad things. So the offensive uses really have an asymmetric advantage. And I would say that we can't give up the rule of law to fight an asymmetric threat. So I'd argue today that we have incredibly powerful computers, but we don't have very good software for them. And it's only in retrospect, after the better software comes along, you take it and you run it on a 10-year-old machine and say, God, the machine was that fast. Remember when they took the Apple Mac interface and they put it back on the Apple II? The Apple II was perfectly capable of running that kind of interface. We just didn't know how to do it at the time. Now, I wanted to give you a specific example of a new material that was discovered 15 years ago. If we take carbon nanotubes, GM had discovered them in 1991. They just have incredible properties, and these are the kinds of things we're going to discover as we start to engineer at the nanoscale. Their strength, they're almost the strongest material, tensile strength material known. They're very, very stiff. They stretch very, very little. In 2 dimensions, if you make like a fabric out of them, they're 30 times stronger than Kevlar. And if you make a 3-dimensional structure like a buckyball, they have all sorts of incredible properties. If you shoot a particle at them and knock a hole in them, they repair themselves. They go zip and they repair the hole in femtoseconds, it's really quick. If you shine light on them, they produce electricity. In fact, if you flash them with a camera, they catch on fire. If you put electricity on them, they emit light. If you run current through them, you can run 1,000 times more current through one of these than through a piece of metal. You can make both P and N type semiconductors, which means you can make transistors out of them. They conduct heat along their length, but not across there's no width, but not in the other direction if you stack them up. That's a property of carbon fiber also. If you put particles in them, they go shooting out the tip. They're like miniature linear accelerators or electron guns. The inside of the nanotubes is so small, the smallest ones are 0.7 nanometers, that it's basically a quantum world. What we see is with these and other new materials that we can do things with different properties, lighter, stronger, and apply these new materials to the environmental problems. New materials that can make water, new materials that can make fuel cells work better, new materials that catalyze chemical reactions that cut pollution and so on. Ethanol, new ways of making ethanol, new ways of making electric transportation. The whole green dream, because it can be profitable. Ray Kurzweil and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about how publishing the 1918 genome was very dangerous, and John Doerr and Brooke and others got concerned, Brooke Bowers, and we started looking around at what the world was doing about being prepared for a pandemic, and we saw a lot of gaps. And so we asked ourselves, can we find innovative things that will go fill these gaps? And as Brooke told me in a break here, he said he's found so much stuff he can't sleep. Just there's so many great technologies out there. So if we can use technology, help address education, help address the environment, help address the pandemic, does that solve the larger problem that I was talking about in the Wired article? And I'm afraid the answer is really no, because you can't solve a problem with the management technology with more technology. If we let an unlimited amount of power loose, then a very small number of people will be able to abuse it. We can't fight it at a 1,000,000-to-1 disadvantage. How could you keep the law? I think the law would be a really good thing to keep. Well, you have to hold people accountable. The law requires accountability. Today, scientists, technologists, businessmen, engineers don't have any personal responsibility for the consequences of their actions. So if you have to tie that back with the law. And finally, I think we have to do something that's it's almost unacceptable to say, is which we have to begin to design the future. We can't pick the future, but we can steer the future. Our investment in trying to prevent pandemic flu is affecting the distribution of possible outcomes. We may not be able to stop it, but the likelihood that it'll get past us is lower if we focus on that problem. So we can design the future if we choose what kind of things we want to have happen and not have happen, and steer us to a lower risk place. But above all, what we have to do is we have to help the good guys, the people on the defensive side, have an advantage over the people who want to abuse things. And what we have to do that is we have to limit access to certain information. And growing up as we have and holding very high the value of free speech, this is a hard thing for us to accept, for all of us to accept. It's especially hard for the scientists to accept who still remember, Galileo essentially locked up and who are still fighting this battle against the church. But that's the price of having a civilization. The price of retaining the rule of law is to limit the access to the great and kind of unbridled power.
There'll be new dangers from these new technologies. I mean, I'm optimistic, but not sanguine. And I'm not necessarily convinced that we won't encounter painful episodes. I think overall we'll be helped more than we're hurt. But, I mean, you only have to look at the 20th century. We had 180 million people die in the wars of the 20th century. That scale of destruction was made possible by technology. We've also helped ourselves enormously, because human life expectancy was 48 in 1900. So we need to address these dangers and downsides. I mean, that's what worries me.
Throughout human history, people have tried to create utopia, the perfect society. In fact, America, the American dream, in some sense, was based on utopianism. Why do we have the Shaker movement? Why did we have the Quakers? Why did we have so many different kinds of religious movements that fled Europe looking to create a utopia here in the Americas? Well, we know the Shakers have disappeared, and many of these colonies have also disappeared, only to be found in footnotes in American textbooks. And the question is why? One reason why is scarcity. Because back then, the Industrial Revolution was still young, and societies had scarcity. Scarcity creates conflict. And unless you have a way to resolve conflict, your colony falls apart. How do you allocate resources? Who gets access to food when there's a famine? Who gets shelter when there's a snowstorm and all of a sudden you've eaten up your seed corn? These are questions that face the early American colonists, and that's the reason why we only see the ghost towns of these utopias. However, now we have nanotechnology. And with nanotechnology, perhaps, who knows, maybe in 100 years, we'll have something called the replicator. Now, the replicator is something you see in Star Trek. It's called the molecular assembler, and it takes ordinary raw materials, breaks them up at the atomic level, and joins the joints in different ways to create new substances. If you have a molecular assembler, you can turn, for example, a glass into wood, or vice versa. You would have the power of a magician. In fact, the power of a god. The ability to literally transform the atoms of one substance into another. And we see it on Star Trek. It's also the most subversive device of all, because if utopias fail because of scarcity, then what happens when you have infinite abundance? What happens when you simply ask and it comes to you? One of my favorite episodes on Star Trek is when the Enterprise encounters a space capsule left over from the 20th century, the bad 20th century. People died of all these horrible diseases, and many people froze themselves, knowing that in the 23rd century or so, they'll be thawed out and their diseases will be cured. Well, sure enough, it's the 23rd century now. The Enterprise finds a space capsule and begins to revive all these people and cure them of cancer, cure them of incurable genetic diseases. And then one of these individuals, however, was a banker. He's revived, and he says to himself, my God, my gamble worked. I'm alive. I'm in the 23rd century. And he said, call my stockbroker. Call my banker. I am rich. I am rich. My investments, they've been sitting there in the bank for centuries. I must be a quadrillionaire. And then the crew of the enterprise looks at this man and says, what is money? What is a bank? What is a stockbroker? We don't have any of these in the 23rd century. And then they say, if you want something, you simply ask for it, and you get it. Now, that's subversive. That's revolutionary. Because if all utopian societies vanish because of scarcity and conflict, what happens when there is no scarcity? What happens when you simply ask and you get what you want? This has enormous philosophical implications. For example, why bother to work? Why bother to go to work when you simply ask for things and it comes to you? Now, some sociologists think that if drugs, for example, are totally legalized, absolutely legalized, then maybe 3 to 5% of the human race will become permanent drug addicts. That's the price for total legalization of drugs. I don't know, but that's a number that people talk about. What happens when we have this society based on replicators? Then will we have 3 to 5% of the human race become permanent parasites? This is a possibility. The whole nature of the human psyche is based around producing things, doing something, making a contribution. What happens when you don't have to do that anymore? What happens when there's infinite plenty? What happens if there is a utopia? The detractors will say, bah, humbug. There is no replicator. It violates the laws of physics. Well, actually, that's not true. There actually is a nanobot that can replicate, actually take apart molecules and rearrange them in fantastic ways. Mother Nature has already created it. It's called the ribosome. The ribosome can take hamburgers, milkshakes, and turn them into a baby in 9 months. That is a miracle. The ribosome takes hamburgers, French fries, potato chips, breaks apart the molecules, and reassembles them into DNA. Mother Nature has created the replicator. It replicates humans. But what happens when humans create replicators by which we can replicate everything?
People have this idea that computers, robots, somehow have to be cold and impersonal and uncaring. I don't see why that's true. I believe we can build artificial minds that are more caring, more compassionate, have better and more stable goal systems than any human being. Once machines can think better than us, all these other technologies will develop faster and faster. Instead of humans developing micro machines, nanomachines, brain scanners, artificial organisms, superhuman minds will be doing this science. At that point, human beings are no longer in control. It's a scary thought, but it's also an exciting one. One thing is for certain, it's not going to be boring.
Back in, I think, 1993, I wrote an essay called On Becoming Posthuman, and I wrote that for Free Inquiry magazine, which is probably the premier humanist publication in the United States, the invitation of the editor. And that was a very interesting experience because he told me the response, first of all, it was a huge response. He got more letters responding to it than he had in any previous article. And he said they're pretty evenly divided, 50-50, but half of them said, this is really fascinating, I'd like to know more about this, it sounds like a good idea. And the other half thought this was a terrible idea because it was challenging humanism. It was challenging the idea that we should just be the best humans we can be, because we're saying we can become something more than human. So those people sort of clung on to the current idea of the human, whereas I think the other half understood that we're really building on humanism. So I see transhumanism as a direct descendant of that, of the Enlightenment humanist project, of challenging every orthodox belief, challenging everything that we currently accept and saying, why can't we do better? Why can't we improve human biology? Why can't we change our genome? Just because it's the way it is doesn't mean it's as good as it can be. Why do we age and die? Why can't we do something about that? People tend to make an apparently clear distinction between treating a disease or a dysfunction, therefore getting a cochlear implant or a new heart valve, on the one hand, and enhancement on the other. A true enhancement would mean essentially becoming something better than you are, or higher functioning, perhaps better than any human being is. But that distinction is really pretty blurry the more you look at it. However, I think what we'll see is that as these become available and tested and safe, that people will very quickly forget their objections. It'll be very much like, say, open heart surgery. When that was first introduced, most people, wouldn't realize this now, but most people were horrified by the idea. I mean, not really surprisingly if you think about it. We're talking about cutting your chest open and sticking your hands in there and moving things around and sewing things up. That actually is a fairly gruesome idea. But now we think, oh, okay, if I have to have it done, I'm not looking forward to it, but everybody does it. I think if we have life extension technologies, if we have cognitive upgrades, people will very quickly realize the benefits and advantages of those. It's certainly true that we've always extended ourselves physically and cognitively. We've used external calculating device like the abacus, for a long time. We've used various kinds of artificial teeth actually for many centuries. So yeah, and stones obviously to increase our ability to cut and to stab and to build things. So yes, we've extended the body and the mind for many, many years. I don't really call that transhuman. I tend to reserve that term for something that really makes a fundamental change in the human condition. And by the human condition, if that's not to be arbitrary, I think it has to mean defined by our genes, because that's what separates us from other species. So if our genes then lead to a certain kind of brain development, a certain ability in the range of visual acuity, of auditory perception, which are limited by the way our genes have built us, then when we start talking about directly altering those genes to give us abilities beyond that, or implanting devices, or doing some of the re-engineering of the human body or brain that allows us to have perceptual and cognitive and emotional ranges beyond that of any human being, then we can talk about transhuman. So wearing eye contact lenses doesn't really make you transhuman, but it's all part of the same process of augmenting ourselves. It seemed to me many people may not have a clear idea of what transhumanism is. They'd heard many talks about various particular aspects, certain technologies, whether it's robotics or AI or biotechnology, but they may be wondering, well, how does this all fit together? What exactly is transhumanism? But really the core of transhumanism is the idea of using reason, science, and technology backed by goodwill to overcome fundamental human limits, to live longer than we've ever lived, to become smarter, to become emotionally better than we've ever been. That is the core of it. All the other things are details. The particular technologies are not the essence of it. Maybe we'll use nanotechnology, maybe we'll use some other method, maybe we'll use biotechnology. So it's good to have arguments about which technology is most effective and most promising, but that's not the core of what defines transhumanism. There are a certain number of objections that come up frequently, especially when we talk about life extension. There are typical ones about, what about overpopulation, what about resources, won't I become bored, won't dictators stay on for millions of years ruling their countries? Other people complain that it's somehow unnatural, even though human nature has always been about modifying ourselves and changing ourselves. So certain standard objections come up, and to me they're all based on a combination of fear and lack of imagination. Essentially what people usually do when they think about these distant scenarios, they tend to project how we are today into the future. So for one thing, you talk about life extension, bizarrely they automatically think that we're talking about living older and getting older and older and more decrepit, and of course you would want to live like that, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about living youthfully and vigorously, in fact better than we've ever been. Or they project other things remaining the same, not having any different technology, no better means of dealing with the environment. The fact is that we've had environmental crises throughout human history. Back in the early Industrial Revolution, the British were burning all the forests for wood. But does that mean there are no trees left on the planet now? No, because we go through cycles. We learn new technologies, new ways of producing energy, and the same way we will respond to those challenges. So I think what transhumanists are pretty good at is thinking along multiple tracks. They can think about multiple changes at a time, not just one single change. That's not the way the world works. So almost all these objections are based on this false idea that one thing will change and nothing else will. Well, they just can't imagine other possibilities. They can't imagine new technologies changing the rules, as they have always done and will continue to do so. One of the most attractive things about transhumanism, I think, is it's a very thoroughgoing philosophy of improvement. It's about self-improvement, it's about improving society, about improving the economy, about improving all our possibilities. So it's fundamentally a very progressive philosophy. It's very popular, especially among young people, to make a big deal of being an anti-racist and anti-sexist. Transhumanists find that a little bit of a yawner because, of course, that's very obvious. If we're talking about making radical alterations to ourselves, then differences in skin color and gender seem pretty trivial by comparison. So it's attractive because it really overcomes those rather artificial distinctions and looks well beyond them to what can we individually and as a species do to vastly improve our condition. So that has to be attractive. It's bringing back a vision into society that's been lacking for some time. I think we've become so focused on short-term problems and complaining about how things are that we've lost a lot of that vision. In the Enlightenment, that was the thing. They came out of the Dark Ages when nothing much good had happened for 1,000 years. And so it was a very exciting view that, with scientific method, we can actually improve life. If you're at the mercy of nature, if you're stuck in one particular environment, you can't meet anybody else. You become very insular in your tribe, and everybody else is seen as an enemy. You become very narrow in your thinking. The long run of technological progress and of economic development means that we can afford to be generous. We can afford to treat people outside our immediate tribe as part of the same community. The level of violence has declined, as a number of recent books have been arguing. If you look at the actual trends, violence has massively declined over the last few centuries as we become wealthier and smarter and more civilized. So yes, somehow it's always the very latest technology that's dehumanizing. So I think, in another 50 years, people will look at genetic engineering and, oh no, that's fine, but there'll be some other technology that's dehumanizing. So it's really a matter of the unfamiliarity combined with the unfortunate tendency of science fiction, especially in movies, to always portray dystopias, these dehumanized futures, just because that's lazy and easy to portray. It's much harder to portray a future where technology has mostly beneficial effects. It's much easier to show producing these robotic cyborgs that will go around trying to kill the rest of humanity. So unfortunately, that feeds that kind of view of dehumanization of technology.
I read some interviews between the Dalai Lama and a number of scientists, and some of them asked him about artificial intelligence and consciousness. Can machines ever truly think? Can they truly feel and understand? Can they be self-aware? But he said in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way that perhaps one day when programmers die, they will be reincarnated in artificial intelligence programs.
In the future, everything will become intelligent. Nanobots will infuse all the matter around us with information. Rocks, trees, everything will become these intelligent computers. So at that point, we can expand out into the rest of the universe. We will be sending basically nanotechnology infused with artificial intelligence. Swarms of those will go out into the universe and basically find other matter and energy that we can then harness to expand the overall intelligence of our human-machine civilization. So the universe will wake up, it'll become intelligent, and that will multiply our intelligence trillions of trillions fold. We can't really fully contemplate, and that's really the main reason this is called the singularity. But regardless of what you call it, it will be the universe waking up. So does God exist? Well, I would say not yet.
Most men become more tolerant with more broad-mindedness. If we create an artificially intelligent being, able to think like a human, and connected to all human knowledge through the internet, one might conclude this being to be extremely broad-minded and thus very tolerant to humans and life in general. We should not fear the machines, we should merge with them.
You will become one with the Borg. You will all become one with the Borg.
He's an author, he's an inventor, he's an innovator, and this is our conversation. Ray, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Neil.
Yeah, so let me just up front say I'm probably your biggest skeptic, just so you know. That's what you got. So you ready for this?
You're probably not the biggest skeptic.
So I'm going to pretend like we're just at a bar, just arguing. First, I'm angry with you for taking our word singularity. That word had a perfectly good use, perfectly fine definition. It's what happens at the beginning of the universe and in the center of a black hole, and you had to go up and name it something else.
Yeah, well, John von Neumann actually came up with that.
Okay.
He said history is approaching a singularity because progress is accelerating at an exponential pace, and it's going to reach a point where progress is so fast it's going to be a singularity in history.
This is John von Neumann, the computer
Yeah.
computing pioneer.
Yeah, he invented the architecture that all computers use today. Although actually Babbage invented it a century earlier, but John von Neumann...
The Babbage, it was a machine he invented.
Babbage created a mechanical computer that never actually worked, but it actually had the architecture we use today. John von Neumann derived it independently a century later.
So what's your background, actually, just so I get some sense of this?
Well, I decided I was going to be an inventor when I was 5. And discovered the computer when I was 12. Not so amazing for 12-year-olds today, but there were only like 12 computers in all of New York City.
You're a native New Yorker?
When I was 12, yeah. I was actually...
So I have to ask you what high school you went to. I have to ask you.
Martin Van Buren High School.
Martin
But it was
Van Buren.
actually IBM 1620 at Flower and Fifth Avenue Hospital in Spanish Harlem, which I had the midnight to 8 a.m. shift.
As a what?
I was programming.
So you were a computer person for the hospital on that computer?
Yeah, in fact, I created the statistical tests that we use to evaluate the Head Start program.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like analyses of variance and so on.
Wow. So you go way back.
Yeah, well, it's only 50 years.
Okay. You go way back in a human lifetime, not in a cosmological timescale. So at what point, you wrote a book called The Singularity. It was,
The Singularity is
back in
near.
This is what, like, cult leaders, the end is near.
Well,
back in 2006, you write this book.
It is a play on the end is near.
Okay. Yeah. What did you predict at that time?
Well, actually, going back to a book I wrote in the 1990s, The Age of Spiritual Machines, I predicted that...
The Age of Spiritual Machines?
Yeah.
Okay.
By 2029, computers would have all of the intellectual and emotional capabilities of humans, and so they would be spiritual machines. And conversely, we are spiritual machines because our brains are composed of 300 million modules that recognize patterns. Each of those modules has 100 neurons. Those neurons have ion channels and dendrites and axons, and basically you can describe, based on physics, which you know
the electrochemical pathways,
how they work, and we can actually model them, and we are modeling and simulating the brain today, and they are, so each neuron is a machine. Very few people would disagree with that. Well, then, you know, the 30 billion neurons in our neocortex is a machine also. And actually, we can understand it. I mean, my most recent book, How to Create a Mind, talks about how that machine works.
That sounds diabolical, how to create a mind. What's going on in your basement? You can tell me, nobody's looking, tell me.
Well, we are understanding how human intelligence works. I mean, these things are brain extenders already.
Yeah,
we are
the smartphone that you point to.
Our brain is already expanded in the cloud. We're smarter as a result. We'll directly connect our neocortex in the 2030s.
Wait, let me.
Well, the last time we did that was 2 million years ago when we went from primates to humanoids, and we got these large foreheads. And we had the frontal cortex, which is where we do language and art and science and physics and radio shows. No other species does that. But it's not qualitatively different. The frontal cortex is actually was just an additional quantity of neocortex. The neocortex is organized in a hierarchy, and we took that additional neocortex and put it at the top of the hierarchy. And as you go up the hierarchy, things get more abstract. So things like music and poetry exist at the top of the neocortical hierarchy. And we're going to add to it again by connecting our neocortex to the cloud and to synthetic neocortex and expanding it the way we did 2 million years ago, except this time it won't be limited by a fixed enclosure. We'll be able to expand it without limit.
What's the difference between extending the power of your brain through some connection into silicon-based intelligence versus just having access on your hip to all of that extra knowledge and intelligence?
I think there's no substantial difference. I mean, I think this is a brain extender.
Because people talk about, plugging some USB port into your...
Well, the scenario I think that is realistic is computers are getting smaller and smaller. We'll have nanorobots at the size of blood cells that have computers in them. that go into the brain through the capillaries and communicate with our neurons. We already know how to do that. You know, people with Parkinson's disease already have computer connections into their brain. That will communicate wirelessly to the cloud. You know, this computer on my hip communicates wirelessly to the cloud. It can multiply itself 10,000-fold by accessing thousands of computers when we need them in the cloud. It can access millions of computers of information. So a kid in Africa with a smartphone is accessing all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes by connecting wirelessly to the cloud.
But then why invoke the brain-machine connection at that point? Who cares? You got the machine.
Because it's a much faster interface. I mean, our fingers are very slow compared to. We could have, you know, millions of.
I didn't know the world was going too slowly for you. You want to speed it up, okay?
Well, it is. I mean, how long does it take you to read? You know,
to read and write?
The Brothers Karamazov. It takes, you know, months.
So you're suggesting that you can get these nanobots the size of your neurosynapses, let's say, and one will be preloaded with War and Peace, the novel, and would somehow injected into your neurosynaptic memory banks, and then you're done. You've got it. Just like in the Matrix, they would load memory programs into you.
We will connect to neocortical hierarchies in the cloud. Some of that could have preloaded knowledge. We could communicate with each other more intimately that way. But basically, we'll expand the size of our neocortex. And that's it. You know, what's the difference between a mouse and a primate is the primate has more neocortex. It's therefore smarter, can master more levels of abstraction. And when we got these large foreheads becoming humanoids, we had more, and that was the enabling factor for us to invent language.
So the wireless cloud becomes the growth of our neocortex.
Right.
Into the next dimension.
We'll have the opportunity again to grow our neocortex. And once again, we'll put that additional neocortex at the top of the hierarchy. And as you go up the hierarchy, the level of abstraction gets greater. So music and art and poetry and radio programs all exist at the top of that hierarchy. At the bottom of the hierarchy, I can tell that rug on the floor is a straight line and very simple things like that. It's the top of the hierarchy where the interesting things happen. And we have not been able to expand it for 2 million years because we have this fixed enclosure. That was very clever.
Our heads are not getting bigger because you kill the mother being born, and it's a bloody mess. So I think we've maximized the size of our head.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Given the size of the birth canal.
That's the reason that we've not been able to expand it anymore. In fact, it was quite a challenge to expand it 2 million years ago.
Even to what we have today.
Yeah.
So why the precision in your prediction, 2029? That sounds audaciously precise.
Well, there's one thing that's surprisingly predictable, which is the pace of the exponential growth of information technology. The price, performance, and capacity of information technologies like computation, communication, now biological technologies like sequencing and also simulating biological processes, the amount of data we're getting on the brain, many different measures, not of everything, but of information technology, follow amazingly precise trajectories. And
growth trajectories.
Right, and they're exponential. So I mean, I was looking, actually it was 1981, I realized that timing was critical to being successful as an inventor. It's also true for anything else you might want to do, you know, doing physics or romance. I mean, you got to be in the right place with the right idea at the right time. So I started with the common wisdom that you cannot predict the future, and I made a surprising discovery. Lots of things are unpredictable, but if you look at the price, performance, and capacity of information technology, like, for example, the price performance of computing, calculations per second per constant dollar, it follows an amazingly predictable trajectory, going back to the 1890 American census. And so I actually projected out those curves that I had in 1981 through 1980, through 2050. We're now in 2015. It's been more than 30 years later, and it's exactly where it should be.
You're on the line.
So that aspect of the future is amazingly predictable. I predicted we'd need search engines in the late 1990s. I made that prediction in the early 80s because I saw the ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet, expanding exponentially.
One of the great jokes that was only a joke for 6 months was the internet is the world's greatest library, except all the books are scattered on the floor. That was before search engines came in. And within a couple of years, search engines came, and now that reference doesn't even work.
Right. Well, I saw that we did have a need in the late 1990s for search engines because there'd be so much knowledge on the web that we couldn't find anything. And we'd have the computation and communication resources to do a good job with that. What I was not able to predict, and what we can't predict, is that of the 50 projects to do that, it'd be these couple of kids in a Stanford dorm who would take over the world of search. And not everything's predictable.
This would be Google, yeah.
I wouldn't have to work very hard if I had made that prediction. And I actually took my first job ever, at least for a company I didn't start myself.
I was wondering if you actually ever had a stable job, or you're just riding on your...
Well, that's a stable job for a pretty unusual company. Yeah. This aspect of the future is very predictable. If you measure the capacity and price performance of these different information technologies, computation, communication, biological technologies, technologies having to do with the brain, they follow these very predictable trajectories. One of the reasons you might be skeptical is it's not intuitive. Our intuition is linear. And so the difference between myself and my skeptics or critics is we're both looking at the same present, and people then apply their linear intuition about the future. I mean, if you wonder...
No, I can think exponentially. I'm skeptical for different reasons than that, but go on. I'll get there.
Well, you know, if you wonder why we have a brain, it's to predict the future. But the kind of challenges we had, 50,000 years ago, when our brains were evolving, were linear ones.
We have no exponential training at all.
We track an animal in the field, and we don't expect it to speed up as it goes along. We expect it to go at a constant pace. That worked very well. That became hardwired in our brains. That's our intuition about the future. And a linear progression, that's our intuition, goes 1, 2, 3. An exponential one, that's the reality of information technology, is 1, 2, 4. It doesn't sound that different, except by the time you get to step 30, the linear progression, our intuition, is at 30. The exponential one is at 1 billion. It makes it very
proud of me for knowing that? 2 to the 30th is 1 billion. I got that.
Yeah. That's good. It's good to know.
So I know, I got you on that. My skepticism comes from a different place.
Okay.
But so here you go. So you're right on the curve as time goes on. This gives you confidence in your modeling. And so now you say 2029, what happens?
Well, actually, somewhat before that, we'll have the computational capacity to functionally simulate the human brain. So that's a whole discussion of what is the capacity of the human brain. And there's actually been derivations using different methodologies, all of which come to the same results. It's about 10 to the 14th calculations per second to functionally simulate the brain. That doesn't mean simulating every molecule. It means basically...
10 to the 14th is a huge number. That's huge.
It's pretty big. I mean, our supercomputers now surpass that. They're up to 10 to the 16th, 10 to the 17th. But we'll have...
I guess in our own, when you're sitting there just watching the ball game, you're not thinking you're going through 10 to the 14th calculations or thoughts per second.
It's all happening simultaneously.
Yeah. It's not an active thought that our brain is that active. That's all.
Well, it does have tremendous capacity, but it's also limited. We have these 300 million pattern recognition modules in our neocortex, and that's a lot from one perspective. That was enough for humans to invent music. I mean, no other animal can keep a beat. No other animal.
Some humans can't either, just to be clear. Okay.
I've met a couple who could, but it's also limited. We have expanded it to some extent by connecting, at least indirectly, with devices.
Right. So you project to the future, some point where computational ability and storage.
Well, computation's one side of the question. The other is the software side. That's a more complicated analysis, but our information about how the brain works is also growing exponentially. The spatial resolution of non-invasive scanning is doubling every year. And a lot of people say, well, it's so complicated because there's billions of different connections, ignoring the fact that there's a lot of repetition and redundancy. There's actually 300 million modules, and they all work pretty much the same way. The neocortex, people thought, oh, that must be very different because that does art and poetry, compared to, let's say, V1, which can tell that there's a straight line in front of me. But it actually turns out to be the same algorithm. But they're organized in a hierarchy, and we put that additional neocortex capacity into the top of the hierarchy. And there are descriptions today. I have one in my book, How to Create a Mind, of roughly, functionally, how the human brain works, how the neocortex works. That's where we do our thinking. We're going to refine that as we get more and more information about the brain.
What's the downside?
So we're going to keep moving in that direction. And I believe we can have a world that's essentially free of poverty, where disease has been greatly reduced, clean up the environment, have plentiful resources in terms of energy and food.
Mm-hmm.
The downside is, I mean, there's lots of movies about the downside.
I don't need you to tell me about what the movies do. All right.
Where, you know, the AI is trying to destroy humanity, and it's the humans against the artificial intelligence or the robots, or it's two groups of humans fighting for control of the AI. One thing that gives me comfort is we don't have one or two AIs in the world. We have 2 or 3 billion AIs. I mean, a smartphone is an artificial intelligence. It's in fact very intelligent, and it accesses the cloud and makes it even more intelligent. And it's in billions of hands. People say, oh, only the wealthy are going to have these technologies that Kurzweil talks about. And I say, yeah, like smartphones, where you in fact had to be wealthy to have a phone, a mobile phone. It wasn't very smart, 20 years ago. And it didn't work.
Only the cool people had mobile phones, like Gecko in Wall Street. There's the famous scene where he's walking on the beach and he's got that sort of shoulder-mounted mobile phone. And I remember seeing that, I say, wow, that's really cool. He's so rich, and he can just walk down the beach with a phone on his shoulder.
And it really didn't work very well. And today they do a million things, and they work much
It's just incidentally a phone, right?
And there's billions of them. I mean, there'll be.
So what of all this talk, whether or not you initiated it, about uploading one's brain to a computer and then the computer becomes you? What do I make of this talk?
Well, that's not really the scenario I think will happen. We've already talked about how we're going to connect to artificial intelligence. Now, we do that mostly indirectly. There are a few people that have computers connected in their brains, like Parkinson's patients, but for the most part, they're not inside our brains, but they may as well be.
So what do you predict will happen in society the day that occurs?
Well, it's not one day. I mean, first of all...
Of course it's not a day, but just...
the predictions I made for today, 30 years ago, people thought were totally ridiculous. Now that it's here, we can't imagine that it ever wasn't the case. Did we ever have a time where there wasn't social networks and mobile devices where you could access all of this knowledge and each other and so on? That was only a few years ago. And so by the time these things happen, we actually get used to them, and they become ubiquitous very quickly, and we forget that it ever wasn't the case. I mean, you can now talk to your computer and ask it questions in natural language. The thing is, when these capabilities emerge, they're kind of clunky and they don't work very well, so people dismiss it saying, well, it doesn't really work. Then by the time it does work well, people say, well, it's been doing that for a long time. It's nothing new. And so it kind of creeps up on us. Computers, we're going to be talking to them, and they're going to get more and more sophisticated, and very gradually they'll become more and more human-like to a point where they're really indistinguishable. So, 100,000 years ago, we couldn't reach that fruit at that higher branch, so we invented a tool that extended our physical reach. And then we invented tools that expanded our muscles, and we could create pyramids and great buildings. Now we can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes. We're always expanding our reach. That's actually what's unique about humans.
And I remain fearless of that, because when you look at machines replacing, in the Industrial Revolution, replacing physical labor, and you look at computers replacing computational labor, the day we lost to Deep Blue in chess, our best chess player loses to a computer at a game that we invent. And then our best Jeopardy player loses
that was more
to
significant,
Watson.
Because that was language. Jeopardy got this correct.
Language and cultural knowledge.
Yeah. Jeopardy got this correct in the rhyme category. A long, tiresome speech delivered by a frothy pie topping. And it quickly said, what is a meringue harangue? And that's pretty impressive.
Wow.
And Jennings and Rutter didn't get that. And Watson got a higher score than the two of them combined. They're the best players in the world. And it got its knowledge not by being programmed with all this information by the engineers, but by reading Wikipedia and several other encyclopedias, 200 million pages of natural language documents.
All on its own.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I don't fear it because it's already happening. Like you said, it happens. It's not a cliff.
We're on that road, and
it's a road that we're on, and I see it, and I embrace it. Actually,
it's a good road. I mean, if you compare human life today with all of its problems, it's far better than it was in the past, and it's going to keep moving in that direction.
Good road to be on, and you help us predict what the road signs will look like.
Working on it.
Right, it's been a delight.
Yeah,
it's been delightful.
Definitely.
So you have cured me of my skepticism of where you're coming from and where you're going. Okay. Until I see your basement, I want to know what you're working on.
Well, you'll never see that.
Ray, in reflecting on human purpose and existence, the question, are we alone, or is the universe filled with other intelligent beings of which we are just a very minor part, is a fundamental one to understand what it's all about. Most scientists would say, based on the numbers, that it is virtually certain that there are other vastly more intelligent civilizations in the universe. You approach this from a technology point of view. Let's explore it.
Well, we can't rule out that they may be out there, but most other scientists actually look at this from a linear perspective and assume that other civilizations are out there, and it would take millions of years to get from where we are now to a point where they might, for example, have solar system or even galaxy-wide technology. Based on the exponential progression of technology, which is really the correct way to look at it, that's the historically accurate view, we've gone in just a century and a half from the Pony Express to where we are now, which is very impressive. And you go out another century and a half, we will be saturating the matter and energy, at least here on Earth, with computational processes that will be trillions of times more powerful than all of human intelligence today. So that's 3 centuries to go from the Pony Express to very transcendent technology that will at least dominate our planet. And in fact, I'd say within a century or so from now, we'll dominate our solar system. And if the SETI assumptions are correct, there should be millions of these civilizations out there. Okay, some would be behind us, some would be ahead of us, but the ones that are ahead of us, which should be about half of them, aren't going to be just 20 years ahead. They're going to be millions of years ahead. Well, it's only a few centuries ahead. They would be taking over their solar system, and within certainly within 1 million years, they would be really taking over their galaxies and would be not only doing galaxy-wide engineering, but would be transforming their galaxies into beacons of incredibly transcendent technology and intelligence. And there should be millions of them that are millions of years ahead of us. And we don't notice any of them. We don't notice anything going on. And people describe this process as finding a needle in a haystack, but a civilization like that would be putting out trillions of needles, which is to say intelligent signals. And now people have arguments why we don't see them. Well, they all blew themselves up. Well, it's possible that if you talk about one civilization, that it blew itself up. But there should be millions of them.
Or they don't want to visit us because we're too primitive and they want to let us develop.
Yeah, that's the Star Trek.
Another one is that they've gotten into virtual reality, so they really don't care about visiting or doing anything. Everything they live in themselves.
Well, they don't use radio signals anymore, but it may be that they find better ways of communicating, but it's still hard to believe that they wouldn't be using electromagnetic signals, at least as a byproduct of second-order effects. I mean, there's bound to be intelligent electromagnetic signals coming from such a civilization at a vast scale. And we would notice this. And you can make an argument as to why any one civilization wouldn't be noticeable, but the whole SETI assumption is there should be millions of them based on the Drake formula.
Maybe even millions in our galaxy alone, and then our galaxy is 100 billion galaxies.
So there should be a vast number, and we don't notice anything
along these lines.
The interesting thing is that big numbers are what drive these assumptions. The big numbers of planets around stars and stars in the galaxy and galaxies in the universe. And so you run that out. What you've done is you've shown that the exponential increase of technology would enable every one of those, if they were technology civilizations, to within million years dominate the universe in some way, again recognizing the speed of light is an issue.
It depends on the speed of light. Certainly within a million years they would dominate and transform their galaxies. And that would be very noticeable, no matter what galaxy it was. If it was within our light sphere, and we have trillions of galaxies within our light sphere, the exponential part is the key process, because once a civilization just reaches the dawn of being radio capable, and we're a little bit past that already, within a century, if not 2 or 3, they will be vastly, trillions of times.
I can even argue, suppose Ray Kurzweil doesn't know what he's talking about and he's off by a whole order of magnitude, so it's 10 times more difficult than you say. So it's 1,000 years instead of 100 years. That's an eye drop in the ocean of time.
Right, but if you don't examine the issue exponentially, if you examine it linearly, you do get a very different perspective. And then the fact that there are millions or billions of these civilizations out there, it takes a very long period of time for them to do anything that's interesting. But that's really not a reasonable assumption if you look at, the history of technology and where it is likely to go.
So what's your conclusion?
My conclusion is we're probably alone. I really would be surprised if we ran into somebody else out there. It's not a proof, because there may be one other civilization that's ahead of us, that happens to be ahead of us, and maybe they have taken the Star Trek ethical command to not be noticeable to us, or maybe we just haven't noticed their signals yet. So it's not a rock solid proof that there cannot be another civilization. But my expectation is that we are alone. If that seems very unlikely, lots of things are unlikely. The existence of our whole universe being so exquisitely calibrated to have all the physical constants to allow for the evolution of complexity is also extremely unlikely. By the anthropic principle, if it weren't the case, we wouldn't be here talking about it. Well, if it weren't the case that we were here on a intelligent civilization, we wouldn't be here talking about it. And if we didn't have some radio technology, this program wouldn't reach your viewers.
If we are indeed alone, would seem to contradict the Copernican principle, which means that humanity is nothing special, and would go against a lot of scientific thinking that has informed our philosophy.
Well, even if we just look here on Earth, there is something special about humans. Yes, we're not the center of the universe, and yes, we didn't descend from the gods, we descended from the worms, but we're the only species that creates knowledge, that passes knowledge down to the next generation, where the knowledge base expands, that creates technology. We have this opposable appendage and this ability to do recursive rational thinking, and can do what-if experiments in our brain. It can change the environment, and they can use the latest generation of tools to create the next. So we have this whole evolutionary process of technology. No other species does that. So even here on Earth, we are very special in that regard. Even though we came from this evolutionary process, we did finally gather those prerequisites to create this whole other evolutionary process, which is technology.
That makes maybe us special here on Earth or among ourselves, but to say we're special in the universe would almost imbue it with some theological implications.
Well, if you assume that sooner or later this would happen, and that is the SETI assumption, that there'd be some civilization that would evolve some kind of ability to manipulate the environment and an ability to think well enough to actually create technology and then have technology evolve. You assume that that will happen sooner or later. Somebody's got to be in the lead, and why not us? I came here first in 1962 when I was 14. I became excited about artificial intelligence. It had only gotten its name 6 years earlier, the 1956 Dartmouth Conference by Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy. So I wrote Minsky a letter. There was no email back then. And he invited me up. He spent all day with me as if he had nothing else to do. He was a consummate educator. The AI field had already bifurcated into two warring camps. The symbolic school, which Minsky was associated with, and the connectionist school was not widely known. In fact, I think it's still not widely known that Minsky actually invented the neural net in 1953, but he had become negative about it, largely because there was a lot of hype that these giant brains could solve any problem. So the first popular neural net, the perceptron, was being promulgated by Frank Rosenblatt at Cornell. So Minsky said, "Oh, where are you going now?" And saying, I said, "To see Rosenblatt at Cornell." He said, "Don't bother doing that." And I went there, and Rosenblatt was touting the perceptron that it ultimately would be able to solve any problem. So I brought some printed letters that had a camera, and it did a perfect job of recognizing them as long as they were Courier 10. Different type style didn't work at all. And he said, "But don't worry. We can take the output of the perceptron and feed it as the input to another perceptron and take the output of that and feed it to a third layer. And as we add more layers, it'll get smarter and smarter and generalize." And I said, "That's interesting. Have you tried that?" "Well, no, but it's high on our research agenda." Things did not move quite as quickly back then as they do now. He died 9 years later, never having tried that idea. Turns out to be remarkably prescient. I mean, he never tried multi-layer neural nets, and all the excitement we see now about deep learning comes from a combination of two things: many-layer neural nets and the law of accelerating returns, which I'll get to a little bit later, which is basically the exponential growth of computing, so that we can run these massive nets and handle massive amounts of data. It would be decades before that idea was tried. Several decades later, 3-level neural nets were tried. They were a little bit better. They could deal with multiple type styles. Still weren't very flexible. Now, it's not hard to add other layers. It's a very straightforward concept. There was a math problem, the disappearing gradient or the exploding gradient, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Basically, you need to take maximum advantage of the range of values in the gradients, not let them explode or disappear and lose the resolution. That's a fairly straightforward mathematical transformation. With that insight, we could now go to 100-layer neural nets, and that's behind sort of all the fantastic gains that we've seen recently. AlphaGo trained on every online game and then became a fair Go player. It then trained itself by playing itself and soared past the best human. AlphaGo Zero started with no human input at all. Within hours of iteration, soared past AlphaGo. Also soared past the best chess programs. They had another innovation. Basically, you need to evaluate the quality of the board at each point, and they used another 100-layer neural net to do that evaluation. So there's still a problem in the field.
which is, there's a motto that life begins at 1 billion examples. One of the reasons I'm at Google is we have 1 billion examples, for examples of pictures of dogs and cats that are labeled. So you got a picture of a cat and it says cat, and then you can learn from it, and you need a lot of them. AlphaGo trained on 1 million online moves. That's how many we had of master games. And that only created a sort of fair Go player. A good amateur could defeat it. So they worked around that in the case of Go by basically generating an infinite amount of data by having the system play itself. Had a chat with Demis Hassabis, what kind of situations can you do that with? You have to have some way of simulating the world. So Go or chess are, even though Go is considered a difficult game, it's, the definition of it exists on one page, so you can simulate it. That applies to math. I mean, math axioms can be contained on a page or two. It's not very complicated. It gets more difficult when you have real life situations, like biology. So we have biological simulators, but the simulators aren't perfect, so learning from the simulators will only be as good as the simulators. That's actually the key to being able to do deep learning on biology. Autonomous vehicles, you need real-life data. So the Waymo systems have gone 3.5 million miles. That's good. That's enough data to then create a very good simulator. So the simulator is really quite realistic because they had a lot of real-world experience, and they've gone 1 billion miles in the simulator. But we don't always have that opportunity to either create the data or have the data around. Humans can learn from a small number of examples. Your significant other, your professor, your boss, your investor can tell you something once or twice, and you might actually learn from that. Some humans have been reported to do that, and that's kind of the remaining advantage of humans. Now, there's actually no backpropagation in the human brain. It doesn't use deep learning. It uses a different architecture. That same year, in 1962, I wrote a paper, How I Thought the Human Brain Worked. There was actually very little neuroscience to go on. There was one neuroscientist, Vernon Mountcastle, that had something relevant to say, which is there was the common wisdom at the time, and there's still a lot of neuroscientists that say this, that we have all these different regions of the brain. They do different things. They must be different. There's V1 in the back of the head where the optic nerve spills into, that can tell that that's a curved line, that's a straight line, does these simple feature extractions on visual images. It's actually a large part of the neocortex. There's a fusiform gyrus up here, which can recognize faces. We know that because if it gets knocked out through injury or stroke, people can't recognize faces. They will learn it again with a different region of the neocortex. It's the famous frontal cortex, which does language and poetry and music. So these must work on different principles. He did autopsies on the neocortex in all these different regions and found they all looked the same. They had the same repeating pattern, same interconnections. He said neocortex is neocortex. So I had that hint. Otherwise, I could actually observe human brains in action, which I did from time to time. And there's a lot of hints that you can get that way. For example, if I ask you to recite the alphabet, you actually don't do it from A to Z. You do it as a sequence of sequences, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. So we learn things as forward sequences of sequences. Forward, because if I ask you to recite the alphabet backwards, you can't do it unless you learn that as a new sequence. So these are all interesting hints. I wrote a paper that the neocortex is organized as a hierarchy of modules, and each module can learn a simple pattern. And that's how I got to meet President Johnson, and that initiated a half century of thinking about this issue. I came to MIT to study with Marvin Minsky. Actually, I came for two reasons. One, that Minsky became my mentor, which was a mentorship that lasted for over 50 years. The fact that MIT was so advanced, it actually had a computer, which the other colleges I considered didn't have. It was an IBM 7094, 32K of 36-bit words, so it's 150K of core storage, 2 microsecond cycle time, 2 cycles per instruction, so a quarter of a MIP, and thousands of students and professors shared that one machine. In 2012, I wrote a book about this thesis. It's now actually an explosion of neuroscience evidence to support it. The European Brain Reverse Engineering Project has identified a repeating module of about 100 neurons. It's repeated 300 million times. So it's about 30 billion neurons in the neocortex. The neocortex is the outer layer of the brain. It's the part where we do our thinking. And they can see in each module axons coming in from another module. And then the single output axon of that module goes as the input to another module. So we can see it organized as a hierarchy. It's not a physical hierarchy. The hierarchy comes from these connections. The neocortex is a very thin structure. It's actually 1 module thick. There's 6 layers of neurons, but it constitutes 1 module. And we can see that it learns a simple pattern. And for various reasons I cite in the book, the pattern recognition model it's using is basically a hidden Markov model. How many of you have worked with Markov models? Okay. That's usually no hands go up when I ask that question. But a Markov model is not, it is learned, but it's not backpropagation. It can learn local features. So it's very good for speech recognition. And the speech recognition work I did in the 80s used these Markov models. That became the standard approach because it can deal with local variations. So the fact that a vowel is stretched, you can learn that in a Markov model. It doesn't learn long distance relationships. That's handled by the hierarchy. And something we don't fully understand yet is exactly how the neocortex creates that hierarchy. But we have figured out how it can connect this module to this module. Does it then grow? I mean, there's no virtual communication or wireless communication. It's an actual connection. So does it grow an axon, from one place to another, which could be inches apart? Actually, all these connections are there from birth, like the streets and avenues of Manhattan. There's vertical and horizontal connections. So if it decides, and how it makes that decision is still not fully understood, that it wants to connect this module to this module, there's already a horizontal and a vertical connection. It just activates them. We can actually see that now, and it can see that happening in real time on non-invasive brain scans. So there's a tremendous amount of evidence that, in fact, the neocortex is a hierarchy of modules that can learn. Each module learns a simple sequential pattern. And even though the patterns we perceive don't seem like sequences, they may seem three-dimensional or even more complicated, they are, in fact, represented as sequences. But the complexity comes in with the hierarchy. So the neocortex emerged 200 million years ago with mammals. All mammals have a neocortex. It's one of the distinguishing features of mammals. These first mammals were small. They were rodents. but they were capable of a new type of thinking. Other non-mammalian animals had fixed behaviors, but those fixed behaviors were very well adapted for their ecological niche. But these new mammals could invent a new behavior. So creativity and innovation was one feature of the neocortex. So a mouse is escaping a predator, its usual escape path is blocked, it will invent a new behavior to deal with it. Probably wouldn't work, but if it did work, it would remember it and it would have a new behavior. And that behavior could spread virally through the community. Another mouse watching this would say to itself, that was really clever going around that rock. I'm going to remember to do that. And it would have a new behavior. Didn't help these early mammals that much because, as I say, the non-mammalian animals were very well adapted to their niches, and nothing much happened for 135 million years. But then 65 million years ago, something did happen. There was a sudden violent change to the environment. We now call it the Cretaceous extinction event. There's been debate as to whether it was a meteor or an asteroid. I mean, a meteor or a volcanic eruption. The asteroid or meteor hypothesis is in the ascendancy. But if you dig down to an area of rock reflecting 65 million years ago, the geologists will explain that it shows a very violent, sudden change to the environment. And we see it all around the globe. So it was a worldwide phenomenon. The reason we call it an extinction event is that's when the dinosaurs went extinct. That's when 75% of all the animal and plant species went extinct. And that's when mammals overtook their ecological niche. So to anthropomorphize, biological evolution said to itself, this neocortex is pretty good stuff, and it began to grow it. So now mammals got bigger, their brains got bigger at an even faster pace, taking up a larger fraction of their body. The neocortex got bigger even faster than that and developed these curvatures that are distinctive of a primate brain, basically to increase its surface area. But if you stretched it out, the human neocortex is still a flat structure. It's about the size of a table napkin, just as thin. And it basically created primates which became dominant in their ecological niche. Then something else happened 2 million years ago. Biological evolution decided to increase the neocortex further and increase the size of the enclosure and basically filled up the frontal cortex with our big skulls with more neocortex. And up until recently, it was felt that, as I said, that the frontal cortex was different because it does these qualitatively different things. But we now realize that it's really just additional neocortex. So remember what we did with it. We're already doing a very good job of being primates, so we put it at the top of the neocortical hierarchy, and we increased the size of the hierarchy. It was maybe 20% more neocortex, but it doubled or tripled the number of levels, because as you go up the hierarchy, it's kind of like a pyramid. There's fewer and fewer modules. And that was the enabling factor for us to invent language and art, music. Every human culture we've ever discovered has music. No primate culture really has music. There's debate about that, but it's really true. Invention, technology. Technology required another evolutionary adaptation, which is this humble appendage here. No other animal has that. If you look at a chimpanzee, it looks like they have a similar hand, but the thumb is actually down here. It doesn't work very well if you watch them trying to grab a stick. So we could imagine creative solutions. Yeah, I could take that branch and strip off the leaves and put a point on it, and we could actually carry out these ideas and create tools, and then use tools to create new tools, and it started a whole other evolutionary process of tool making. And that all came with the neocortex. So Larry Page read my book in 2012 and liked it, so I met with him and asked him for an investment in a company I'd started actually a couple of weeks earlier to develop those ideas commercially, because that's how I went about things as a serial entrepreneur. And he said, well, we'll invest, but let me give you a better idea. Why don't you do it here at Google? We have 1 billion pictures of dogs and cats, and we got a lot of other data and lots of computers and lots of talent, all of which is true. And says, well, I don't know. I just started this company to develop this. I said, well, we'll buy your company. And I said, how are you going to value a company that hasn't done anything and just started a couple of weeks ago? And he said, we can value anything. So I took my first job 5 years ago, and I've been basically applying this model, this hierarchical model, to understanding language, which I think really is the holy grail of AI. I think Turing was correct in designating basically text communication as what we now call a Turing complete problem, that it requires, there's no simple NLP tricks that you can apply to pass a valid Turing test, with an emphasis on the word valid. Mitch Caper and I had a 6-month debate on what the rules should be, because if you read Turing's 1950 paper, he describes this in a few paragraphs and doesn't really describe how to go about it. But if it's a valid Turing test, meaning it's really convincing you through interrogation and dialogue that it's a human, that requires a full range of human intelligence. And I think that test has stood the test of time. We're making very good progress on that. I mean, just last week, you may have read that 2 systems passed a paragraph comprehension test. It's really very impressive. When I came to Google, we were trying to pass these paragraph comprehension tests. We aced the first grade test. Second grade test, we kind of got average performance. And the third grade test had too much inference. Already you had to know some common sense knowledge, as it's called, and make implications of things that were in different parts of the paragraph. And there was too much inference, and it really didn't work. So this is now adult level, just slightly surpassed average human performance. But we've seen that once an AI does something at average human levels, it doesn't take long for it to soar past average human levels. I think it'll take longer in language than it did in sort of simple games like Go, but it's actually very impressive that it surpasses now average human performance. It's used in LSTM, long short temporal memory. But if you look at the adult test, in order to answer these questions, it has to put together inferences and implications of several different things in the paragraph with some common sense knowledge that's not explicitly stated. So that's, I think, a pretty impressive milestone. So I've been developing, I've got a team of about 45 people, and we've been developing this hierarchical model. We don't use Markov models because we can use deep learning for each module. And so we create an embedding for each word, and we create an embedding for each sentence. I can talk about it because we have a published paper on it. It can take into consideration context. If you use Smart Reply if you use Gmail on your phone, you'll see it gives you 3 suggestions for responses. That's called Smart Reply. They're simple suggestions, but it has to actually understand perhaps a complicated email And the quality of the suggestions is really quite good, quite on point. That's from my team using this kind of hierarchical model. So instead of Markov models, it uses embeddings. Because we can use backpropagation, we might as well use it. But I think what's missing from deep learning is this hierarchical aspect of understanding, because the world is hierarchical. That's why evolution developed a hierarchical brain structure to understand the natural hierarchy in the world. And there's several problems with big, deep neural nets. One is the fact that you really do need a billion examples, and we don't. Sometimes we can generate them, as in the case of Go, or if we have a really good simulator, as in the case of autonomous vehicles. Not quite the case yet in biology. Very often you don't have a billion examples. We certainly have billions of examples of language, but they're not annotated, and how would you annotate it anyway with more language that we can't understand in the first place? So there's kind of a chicken and an egg problem. So I believe this hierarchical structure is needed. Another criticism of deep neural nets is they don't explain themselves very well. It's a big black box that gives you pretty remarkable answers. I mean, in the case of these games, Demis described it's playing in both Go and chess is almost an alien intelligence, because it would do things that were shocking to human experts, like sacrificing a queen and a bishop at the same time, or in close succession, which shocked everybody, but then went on to win. Or early in a Go game, putting a piece at the corner of the board, which is kind of crazy to most experts, because you really want to start controlling territory. And yet, on reflection, that was the brilliant move that enabled it to win that game. But it doesn't really explain how it does these things. So if you have a hierarchy, it's much better at explaining it, because you could look at the content of the modules in the hierarchy, and they'll explain what they're doing. And just to end on the first application of applying this to health and medicine, this will get into high gear, and we're going to really see us break out of the linear extension to longevity that we've experienced. I believe we're only about a decade away from longevity escape velocity. We're adding more time than is going by, not just to infant life expectancy, but to your remaining life expectancy. I think if someone is diligent, they can be there already. I think I've at longevity escape velocity. Now, a word on what life expectancy means. It used to be assumed that not much would happen, so whatever your life expectancy is, with or without scientific progress, it really didn't matter. Now it matters a lot. So life expectancy really means, how long would you live? What's the, in terms of a statistical likelihood, if there were not continued scientific progress? But that's a very inaccurate assumption, that scientific progress is extremely rapid. I mean, just as in AI and biotech, there are advances now, every week. It's quite stunning. Now, you could have a computed life expectancy, let's say 30 years, 50 years, 70 years from now. You could still be hit by the proverbial bus tomorrow. We're working on that with self-driving vehicles. But we'll get to a point, I think if you're diligent, you can be there now in terms of basically advancing your own statistical life expectancy, at least to keep pace with the passage of time. I think it will be there for most of the population, at least if they're diligent, within about a decade. So if you can hang in there, we may get to see the remarkable century ahead. Thank you very much.
A question, please raise your hand and we'll get you a mic.
Hi. So you mentioned both neural network models and symbolic models, and I was wondering how far have you been thinking about combining these two approaches, creating a symbiosis between neural models and symbolic ones?
I don't think we want to use symbolic models as they've been used. How many are familiar with the Psych project? That was a very diligent effort in Texas to define all of common sense reasoning. And it kind of collapsed on itself and became impossible to debug because you'd fix one thing and it would break three other things. That complexity ceiling has become typical of trying to define things through logical rules. Now, it does seem that humans can understand logical rules. We have logical rules written down for things like law and game playing and so on. But you can actually define a connectionist system to have such a high reliability on a certain type of action that it looks like it's a symbolic rule, even though it's represented in a connectionist way. And connection systems can both capture the soft edges, because many things in life are not sharply defined. They can also generate exceptions. So you don't want to sacrifice your queen in chess, except certain situations that might be a good idea. So you can capture that kind of complexity. So we do want to be able to learn from accumulated human wisdom that looks like it's symbolic, but I think we'll do it with a connection system. But again, I think that connection systems should develop a sense of hierarchy and not just be one big massive neural net.
So I understand how we want use the neocortex to extract useful stuff and commercialize that, but I'm wondering how our middle brain and the organs that are below the neocortex will be useful for turning that into what you want to do. So.
Well, the cerebellum is an interesting case in point. It actually has more neurons than the neocortex, and it's used to govern most of our behavior. Some things, if you write a signature, that's actually controlled by the cerebellum. So a simple sequence is stored in the cerebellum, but there's not any reasoning to it. It's basically a script. And most of our movement now has actually been migrated from the cerebellum to the neocortex. Cerebellum is still there. Some people's entire cerebellum is destroyed through disease. They still function fairly normally. Their movement might be a little erratic because our movement is largely controlled by the neocortex, but some of the subtlety is a kind of pre-programmed script, and so they'll look a little clumsy, but they actually function okay. A lot of other areas of the brain control autonomic functions like breathing, and but our thinking really is controlled by the neocortex. In terms of mastering intelligence, I think the neocortex is the brain region we want to study.
I'm curious what you think might happen after the singularity is reached in terms of this exponential growth of information. Yeah, do you think it will continue, or will there be a whole paradigm shift? What do you predict?
Well, in the Singularities near, I talk about the atomic limits. Based on molecular computing as we understand it, and it can actually go well past 2045 and actually go to trillions of times greater computational capacity than we have today. So I don't see that stopping anytime soon, and will go, way beyond what we can imagine. And it becomes an interesting discussion what the impact on human civilization will be. So to take a maybe slightly more mundane issue that comes up is, it's going to eliminate most jobs or all jobs. A point I make is it's not the first time in human history we've done that. How many jobs circa 1900 exist today? And that was the feeling of the Luddites, which was an actual society that formed in 1800 after the automation of the textile industry in England. They looked at all these jobs going away and felt, employment's going to be just limited to an elite. Indeed, those jobs did go away, but new jobs were created. So if I were a prescient futurist in 1900, I would say, 38% of you work on farms and 25% work in factories. That's 2/3 of the working force. But I predict by 2015, 115 years from now, it's going to be 2% on farms and 9% in factories. And everybody would go, oh my God, we're going to be out of work. And I said, well, don't worry. For all these jobs we eliminate through automation, we're going to invent new jobs. And people say, oh, really? What new jobs? And I'd say, well, I don't know. We haven't invented them yet. That's the political problem. We can see jobs very clearly going away fairly soon, like driving a car or a truck. And the new jobs haven't been invented. I mean, just look at the last 5 or 6 years. It's a lot of the increase in employment has been through mobile app-related types of ways of making money that just weren't contemplated even 6 years ago. If I were really prescient, I would say, well, you're going to get jobs creating mobile apps and websites and doing data analytics and self-driving cars. Cars? What's a car? And nobody would have any idea what I'm talking about. Now, the new job, some people say, yeah, we created new jobs, but it's not as many. Actually, we've gone from 24 million jobs in 1900 to 142 million jobs today, from 30% of the population to 45% of the population. The new jobs pay 11 times as much in constant dollars, and they're more interesting. I mean, as I talk to people starting out their career now, they really want a career that gives them some life definition and purpose and gratification. We're moving up Maslow's hierarchy. 100 years ago, you were happy if you had a backbreaking job that put food on your family's table. And we couldn't do these new jobs without enhancing our intelligence. So we've been doing that, for most of the last 100 years through education. We've expanded K through 12 in constant dollars tenfold. We've gone from 38,000 college students in 1870 to 15 million today. More recently, we have brain extenders. They're not yet connected directly in our brain, but they're very close at hand. When I was here at MIT, I had to take my bicycle across campus to get to the computer and show an ID to get in the building. Now we carry them, in our pockets and on our belts. They're going to go inside our bodies and brains. I think that's not a really important distinction. But so we're basically going to be continuing to enhance our capability through merging with AI. And that's the, I think, ultimate answer to the kind of dystopian view we see in futurist movies where it's the AI versus a brave band of humans for control of humanity. We don't have 1 or 2 AIs in the world today. We have several billion, 3 billion smartphones at last count. It'll be 6 billion in just a couple of years, according to the projections. So we're already deeply integrated with this. And I think that's going to continue. And it's going to continue to do things which you can't even imagine today, just as we are doing today things we couldn't imagine, even 20 years ago.
You showed many graphs that go through exponential growth, but I haven't seen one that isn't. So I would be very interested in hearing.
You haven't seen one that what?
That is not exponential. So tell me about regions that you've investigated that have not seen exponential growth, and why do you think that's the case?
Well, price, performance, and capacity of information technology invariably follows an exponential. When it impacts human society, it can be linear. So, for example, the growth of democracy has been linear, but still pretty steady. You could count the number of democracies on the fingers of one hand a century ago. 2 centuries ago, you could count the number of democracies in the world on the fingers of one finger. Now there are dozens of them, and it's become kind of a consensus that that's how we should be governed. So and I attribute all this to the growth in information technology, communication in particular, for progression of social and cultural institutions. But information technology, because it ultimately depends on a vanishingly small energy and material requirement, grows exponentially and will for a long time. There was recently a criticism that, well, chess scores it's actually a remarkably straight linear progression. So humans, I think it's like 2,800, and it just soared past that in 1997 with Deep Blue, and it's kept going. And are remarkably straight and saying, well, this is linear, not exponential. But the chess score is a logarithmic measurement. So it really is exponential progression.
So philosophers like to think a lot about the meaning of things, especially in the 20th century. So, for instance, Martin Heidegger gave a couple of speeches and lectures on the relationship of human society to technology. And he particularly distinguished between the mode of thinking which is calculating thinking and a mode of thinking which is reflective thinking or meditative thinking. And he posed this question: what is the meaning and purpose of technological development? And he couldn't find an answer. He recommended to remain open to what he called he called this an openness to the mystery. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on this. Is there a meaning or purpose to technological development, and is there a way for us humans to access that meaning?
Well, we started using technology to shore up weaknesses in our own capabilities. So physically, I mean, who here could build this building? So we've leveraged the power of our muscles with machines. And we're in fact very bad at doing things that, the simplest computers can do, like factor numbers or even just multiply to 8-digit numbers. Computers can do that trivially. We can't do it, so we originally started using computers to make up for that weakness. I think the essence of what I've been writing about is to master the unique strengths of humanity, creating loving expressions in poetry and music and the kinds of things we associate with the better qualities of humanity with machines. That's the true promise of AI. We're not there yet, but we're making pretty stunning progress. Just in the last year, there's so many milestones that are really significant, including in language. But I think of technology as an expression of humanity. It's part of who we are. And the human species is already a biological, technological civilization. And it's part of who we are. And AI is part of humans. So AI is human, and it's part of the technological expression of humanity, and we use technology to extend our reach. You know, I couldn't reach that fruit at that higher branch 1,000 years ago, so we invented a tool to extend our physical reach. And we now extend our mental reach. We can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes. And we're going to make ourselves literally smarter by merging with AI.
Hi. First of all, honored to hear you speak here. So I first read The Singularity as near 9 years ago or so, and it changed the way I thought entirely, but something I think it caused me to over steeply discount was tail risk in geopolitics, in systems that span the entire globe. And my concern is that there's obviously the possibility of tail risk, existential level events swamping all of these trends that are otherwise war-proof, climate-proof, you name it. So my question for you is, what steps do you think we can take in designing engineered systems, in designing social and economic institutions to kind of minimize our exposure to these tail risks and survive to make it to a beautiful mind-filled future?
Yeah, well, the world was first introduced to a human-made existential risk when I was in elementary school. We would have these civil defense drills, get under our desk and put our hands behind our head to protect us from a thermonuclear war. And it worked. We made it through. But that was really the first introduction to an existential risk. And those weapons are still there, by the way, and they're still on a hair trigger, and they don't get that much attention. There's been a lot of discussion, much of which I've been in the forefront of initiating, on the existential risks of what's sometimes referred to as GNR, G for genetics, which is biotechnology, N for nanotechnology, gray goo, robotics, which is AI. And I've been accused of being an optimist, and I think you have to be an optimist to be an entrepreneur. If you knew all the problems you were going to encounter, you'd never start any project. But I've written a lot about the downsides. I remain optimistic. There are specific paradigms, and not foolproof, that we can follow to keep these technologies safe. So, for example, over 40 years ago, some visionaries recognized the revolutionary potential, both for promise and peril, of biotechnology. Neither the promise nor peril was feasible 40 years ago. But they had a conference at the Asilomar Conference Center in California to develop both professional ethics and strategies to keep biotechnology safe. And they've been known as the Asilomar Guidelines. They've been refined through successive Asilomar conferences. Much of that's baked into law. And in my opinion, it's worked quite well. We're now, as I mentioned, getting profound benefit. It's a trickle today. It'll be a flood over the next decade. And the number of people who have been harmed, either through intentional or accidental abuse of biotechnology, so far is zero. Actually, I take that back. There was one boy who died in gene therapy trials about 12 years ago, and there was congressional hearings, and they canceled all research for gene therapy for a number of years. You could do an interesting master's thesis and demonstrate that 300,000 people died as a result of that delay, but you can't name them. They can't go on CNN, so we don't know who they are. But so that has to do with the balancing of risks. But in large measure, virtually no one has been hurt by biotechnology. Now, that doesn't mean you can cross it off our list. Okay, we took care of that one because the technology keeps getting more sophisticated. CRISPR's a great opportunity. There's hundreds of trials of CRISPR technologies to overcome disease, but it could be abused. You can easily describe scenarios, so we have to keep reinventing it. January, we had our first Asilomar conference on AI ethics. And so I think this is a good paradigm. It's not foolproof. I think the best way we can assure a democratic future that includes our ideas of liberty is to practice that in the world today, because the future world of the singularity, which is a merger of biological and non-biological intelligence, it's not going to come from Mars. I mean, it's going to emerge from our society today. So if we practice these ideals today, it's going to have a higher chance of us practicing them as we get more enhanced with technology. If that doesn't sound like a foolproof solution, it isn't, but I think that's the best approach. In terms of technological solutions, I mean, AI is the most daunting. You can imagine there are technical solutions to biotechnology and nanotechnology. There's really no subroutine you can put in your AI software that will assure that it remains safe. Intelligence is inherently not controllable. If there's some AI that's much smarter than you that's out for your destruction, the best way to deal with that is not to get in that situation in the first place. If you are in that situation, find some AI that will be on your side. But basically, it's going to, I believe we have been headed through technology to a better reality. I go around the world and people really think things are getting worse. And I think that's because our information about what's wrong with the world is getting exponentially better. I say, oh, this is the most peaceful time in human history. And people say, what, are you crazy? Didn't you hear about the event yesterday and last week? And, well, 100 years ago, there could be a battle that wiped out the next village and you wouldn't even hear about it for months. I have all these graphs on education, and literacy has gone from like 10% to 90% over a century, and health, wealth, poverty's declined 95% in Asia over the last 25 years. It's documented by the World Bank. All these trends are very smoothly getting better, and everybody thinks things are getting worse. But you're right, like on violence, that curve could be quite disrupted if there's an existential event. As I say, I'm optimistic, but I think that is something that we need to deal with, and a lot of it is not technological. It's dealing with our social, cultural institutions.
So you mentioned also exponential growth of software and ideas, I guess, related to software. So one of the reasons for which you said that information technology cost is exponential is because of fundamental properties of matter and energy. But in the case of ideas, why would it have to be exponential?
Well, a lot of ideas produce exponential gains. They don't increase performance linearly. There was actually a study during the Obama administration by the Scientific Advisory Board on assessing this question. How much gains on 23 classical engineering problems were gained through hardware improvements over the last decade and software improvements? And there was about 1,000 to 1 improvement, which is about doubling every year from hardware. There was an average of something like 26,000 to 1 through software improvements, algorithmic improvements. So we do see both, and inherently, if you come up with an advance, it doubles the performance or multiplies it by 10. We see basically exponential growth from each innovation. And we certainly see that in deep learning. The architectures are getting better, while we also have more data and more computation and more memory to throw at these algorithms.
Thank you very much.